you started out your first sentence today basically going into recession is pretty much a fait accompli. Can you explain that? You know, down here in Chicago, we're calling it maybe a suppression versus a recession because many think the demand side on the back end of this could be pretty swift at some point in the future.
It could do. Look, I think that whether we're going into recession or not is a question of epidemiology more than economics, and it's also a question of policy response. But that being said, the sudden stop that we've seen, the kind of demand side, supply side, and financial shock that we've seen means that there is a good chance that we'll have 2 quarters of contraction. The question really is going to be how deep is the contraction going to be and how long will it last? And that depends in part on how quickly we can contain the virus. And unfortunately, there's just so much uncertainty around it. We don't know that there's a natural peak for the coronavirus. But it also depends on our policy response. And the Fed, you know, threw the kitchen sink at it last night. But this isn't really for the Fed to handle. The Fed has, you know, successfully worked out kinks in the funding markets. It's gone ahead and supported the banks. But what we really need to see is a massive fiscal response.
Now, considering that the Fed and some of the issues Steve Leisman's done great reporting on, you've written about, you know, Article 13.3 and how things have potentially changed since Dodd-Frank in the last crisis. But at the end of the day, one theme continually comes up, and it's one of the issues I didn't have any problem with back in the credit crisis, some of these programs that really aid. And commercial paper is one of those areas. Do you see a need, and is the Fed going to have any issues, of course, getting Treasury to go along with some of those additional programs in the future?
I think it's almost inevitable that the Fed will have to invoke Article 13.3 in order to buy commercial paper, as it did back during the global financial crisis. Hopefully, Treasury will go along with it. I think there will clearly be a need to. That's how we're going to get cash to small and medium-sized companies that desperately need it. And so I think, you know, we're going to get there. And I think Jay Powell sort of suggested that we would at the end of his phone or press conference by saying, you know, this is what we've got right now. We have other tools that we're going to try to use if we need to. And I think that's one that is certainly first to come out.
Okay, now, Megan, this is a bit uncomfortable for me to get into, but I want to anyway. I think the Fed and all central banks have thrown much more at it than actually the issue warrants at this point, because we know it's a health issue, fiscal, getting money in people's hands quickly. But at the end of the day, my question is simple. Has our central bank in any way erred by basically going from 150 basis points of easing in a short period of time to 0 to 25? You know, at the end of the day, many of my peers here in Chicago say, well, they can always take them back on the backside of this. I don't think that's necessarily a big possibility. Has there been some damage done for those who are nervous about 0 or negative rates in the grand scheme of things?
Well, look, I think you're right. It's going to be really hard for the Fed to take those rate cuts back. But I do think that the Fed acted appropriately in cutting rates all the way down to 0, and also in cutting the discount window or the discount rate significantly. I mean, by doing that effectively, the Fed has removed the effective lower bound. So, you know, negative rates aren't an issue anymore for the U.S. if the Fed decides to use them that way and cut the discount rate into negative territory, much like the ECB has done with its TLTROs. And so, you know, I think what the Fed is saying basically is over to you, Treasury Department. We're giving you rates at 0 for the foreseeable future. It's up to you to come up with a plan, and I think that's appropriate. It does mean that the Fed can't really respond with much more from here on out, and certainly not in the downturn. But, you know, given that we know that a downturn is coming of some sort, I think it was appropriate for the Fed to have acted with such incredible verve last night.
Now, one thing has really changed this morning that I was kind of shocked at. Now, if you looked at where the back end of the market was, long maturities about an hour ago, they were under some significant pressure, and the yield curve, 10s to 2s, just as a generic barometer, you know, toward the end of last week was, you know, 47, 48. Then it dropped under 40. The long end's coming back. It's now down about the same amount as 2-year note yields, so they're both down about 13 basis points, and that spread is back in the high mid-40s. For your final thought, how much credence should we put in all the issues that have been thrown at our market? Because at the end of the day, for me, I'd rather see long-end rates start to grip. I think that would be a good sign in the grand scheme of things.
Look, I wouldn't look too long and hard at the shape of the yield curve right now, just given all the dislocations in the markets. I think what's important is that last week we saw both equities and treasuries sell off, and that's really weird. That suggests that there was significant stress in the funding markets. There were margin calls. A lot of companies were liquidating for cash, and there was a shortage of cash. And the Fed's gone ahead and addressed those issues. And really, that's the best that we can hope for from the Fed. I think, when the yield curve inverted before, it wasn't necessarily a reflection that we were going into a recession either. I think it was a reflection more of just kind of financial quirks. So I wouldn't worry too much about the shape of the yield curve this time around. I would worry much more about funding stress. And the Fed has said, look, we've got your back. We're absolutely taking care of this. And I think the markets find that credible.